Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. Listener discretion is advised. Justin C. Key is a speculative fiction writer and psychiatrist whose short stories have appeared in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Strange Horizons, Tor.com, Escape Pod, and Lightspeed. A graduate of Clarion West, his debut short story collection, The World Wasn't Ready for You, drops September 19th, 2023, and I have the pleasure of having Justin on the podcast today. We talk about horror. We talk about some of our favorite authors. Spoiler alert, it's Stephen King. And we just talk about the process of being creative in general. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Caught on the Mic. If you know anything about me, you know how much of a fan of horror I am. You know I like the scary stuff, the spooky stuff, the thrilling stuff. And joining me today is an author, Justin C. Key. He's got a book coming out on September 19th. The World Wasn't Ready for You. It is a collection of stories. Justin, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here. Excited to be in this space. This is kind of my dream as a writer, to have people read my work and then, want to talk to me about what I've written. So, I'm very excited to be here.
So how long have you been writing? Have you been writing your whole life?
Yeah, I've been writing since I was a kid. I remember I wrote the Butterfly Chronicles when I was in like maybe third grade, and illustrated it, and wrote some short stories when I was in high school. But serious writing has been about 16 years.
Oh, wow.
2007 is when I sat down to start seriously writing. And luckily, I read Stephen King's On Writing, where he said the first million words are practice. So I started getting my practice in. And I've done well over 1 million words now, but it's been quite a journey.
You've got a few other things that are coming out in compilations that we'll talk about later in the episode. But I think right now, before we get into any deeper waters, the appropriate thing would be for you to introduce yourself and tell us your origin story, sir.
Okay. So I am Justin C. Key. And so I grew up in Washington, D.C., and the important thing is that my mom was a librarian at the Library of Congress. So I got all the books that I could want. I was constantly asking her to bring home books. Didn't know that some of them were a little bit above my age range. I read Jurassic Park when I was maybe second grade or so. And just would devour books, devour stories. My mom would tell people that I would pull out a book and sit in the middle of the soccer field. I don't think I actually did that. I don't remember sitting in the middle of the soccer field. Maybe on the sideline, if I wasn't in the game, I would be reading. But always loved reading. At the same time, thought that I wanted to be a doctor when I was a kid. And no one else in my family was a doctor. My family was very supportive and encouraging, not in the toxic way, but they would call me Dr. Key, even when I was young, because they knew I wanted to be a doctor, and very supportive of that. So grew up, went to college out on the West Coast. That was the first time going away from DC. I went to Stanford. And while I was there, I started to think, okay, I've only ever wanted to be a doctor. What if I step back and see if there's something else for me? I started getting more into creative writing while I was there. I had already finished a lot of the human biology major. So I kind of did an English double major, unofficially, just took the classes that I liked taking. And then I remember the summer of 2007, when the last Harry Potter book came out. Me and a friend, we read it just in the same room in a weekend, started Saturday, ended Sunday. And then after that, I sat down and started writing myself, my first novel. which is sitting on my shelf over here, probably never see the light of day. Um, but I started writing. I started writing every day. And eventually I had about 100 pages. And I remember thinking then, I was like, well, I have to finish now. And I think that's been a lot of my writing career. It's like, well, I can't stop now. I've put
Right.
so much time into it. I've gotten so far with this. Like, what's the next thing? What can I create? And I was very thankful to have read Stephen King's On Writing when I started writing back in 2007. I'm a big Stephen King fan. And in it, he said a few things for better, for worse. He said you should write every day. He said he had a story in there about where he told like an interviewer that he doesn't write on holidays like Christmas, but he said that's a lie. He does write on Christmas. He just thought it would be boring to say he wrote every day without any break. He is a pantser, which means that he doesn't outline. And the first million words of practice. So his seventh novel that he wrote was the first one that he published, Carrie. So I remember sitting down to write, and I tell people this today, like when I give advice to like younger writers, I had to simultaneously think that what I was writing in that moment could be the next big thing, while I'm writing it, but also knowing that this may just be practice, that once I finish this, put it aside, start the next thing. Um, so I continued forward after that. And after I finished that novel, I put it aside. I immediately started on the next one. And then I came back to that first one. I went back over it. I revised it. I had people read it. And then I did that for a few years with novels. I submitted to agents, went that whole route of like querying to agents, which I tell people was ultimately a learning experience. Got like some requests for like a full read. Like back then, for me, I would like send out queries to like 50 people, and it's just, it's like cold calling. So some of them you never hear back from. I think somebody responded to me like 3 years later when I was in a completely different space. And it was like they were passing on. I was like, okay, thanks. And then some people say, this sounds interesting. Can I read some? And then a bunch of those people were rejected. And then somebody, maybe one or two, would say, can I read the whole thing? And then ultimately, some people were very nice, or some people said this has a lot of potential, but just not ultimately not what they were going to represent. So then I went to med school. I had taken some time after graduating to go, and I worked at entry level, like a nonprofit, no, a consulting firm for nonprofits in San Francisco, trying to see like if I could just not do medicine and just try writing. I was drawn back to medicine and did some shadowing. So applied to med school, got into med school, and throughout the whole time continued to write, but took a break from the novels and started focusing more on short stories. I also me and my wife and I started having children in med school. So it was a very, very busy time.
Right.
So yeah, so taking a step back and doing short stories was a way for me to have something that was like manageable. I could have like a 3,000 or 5,000 word short story. I also could submit them directly to magazines, and also play around with a lot of different ideas. And while my first love was horror, as I was naturally going through medical school, I started to incorporate it more like science and things that I was learning into my stories. So it's kind of morphed to I do both horror and just medical fiction, if you may. Went through med school, became a psychiatrist. It's very interesting because a lot of writers that I know, writing is like their passion, and then they have like their day job that pays the bill. And early on, someone said that it's going to be hard to have writing plus a career that you're passionate about or put like a lot of like mind energy into. Um, and that's what medicine became for me, going into psychiatry. So I'm a psychiatrist. I have my own practice. I do a lot of therapy. I think I'm fairly good at what I do, just naturally in terms of being a therapist. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot
Right.
emotionally. It takes a lot logistically. Being a doctor and kind of like having that responsibility. And in addition to that, not even on top on, just like separate from that, writing is like a lifelong passion of mine. So I'm very thankful, very fortunate to be able to have like these two career paths I'm both that both of them I'm very passionate about. It takes a lot out of me though.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Before we go on too much further, there's something that kind of caught my attention. And as being a creative myself, this is the vantage point I'm asking this from. Having a career path in behavioral sciences and being a creative yourself, is there any specific methodology that you use to disconnect your ego from the creative works that don't move forward versus the ones that do? Because I love the fact that you mentioned that you almost become obsessive about completing something once you start it. So many people don't do that. That's where a lot of creatives stall, right? But like, I know for me as a former songwriter, I've got bins and bins and bins of everything that I think is the Beatles' greatest hits, but probably aren't.
Yeah.
So how do you disengage your mindset in that regard?
Part of it, I think, has to do with time,
right?
Going through. Like if I would look back at the first novel that I wrote, now even years ago, if I look back at it like 7 years ago, I read it. I was like, oh, I'm glad this didn't get out into the world, you know. I still you can still see remnants of it in my writing, but and I think it was from reading Stephen King, and then I kind of went overboard. I loved metaphors and analogy. Like everything was like a metaphor. Everything was an analogy. I think I have a line in that I remember, and I compared something. I said it was like fairies playing on a banjo, and just like over all the years, I'm like, what was I thinking? Like fairies on a banjo? Like who's, you know? But just I was just like all this flowery stuff and all these, and through time, like what I've done is like whittled that down. But I do think I will say that at a time I thought it was a fault, but I think now that it's an advantage. I do sometimes stubbornly go back and won't let like a story die. I still have in my mind like that first book that I wrote, like later down in my career when I'm in like a place, not sending that version out, but going back and just redoing the whole thing,
Right.
because there's other novels I had back then as well. And I've gotten like good results, I think, from that as well. Like looking back, like one of the stories that's in my collection is coming out. I wrote it one weekend. I was taking a writing weekend, I think maybe in 2014, like, so 9, 10 years ago. And I had submitted it to different magazines and got nice rejections, and even submitted it to an anthology that I thought was like perfect for. And, and once I got my representation for potentially going out and doing a short story collection, I sent it to my agent, not thinking it was going to make the cut, but he loved it. And since then, a lot of people have resonated a lot with that, and it's kind of been a surprise to me. I was like, oh, that's kind of the story that I thought that was, not up to par. So part of me still has a thought of like wanting to go back and do some of those, or bring some of those stories back to life. I definitely have some stories like over the years, especially since there are some when writing them where I felt like, oh, this is very special to me. And since then, I've written more like very special stories, but that feeling still exists kind of when I go back and think about them. And I guess maybe there's a line of my career where stories that were written past a certain point, I probably have like some confidence that, the writing was like good enough at a point that they might be worth going back to. Whereas my first novel, even if somebody was like, hey, I want to see it, I would probably need to go in a room for like 6 months before I would let anybody see that.
You almost answered that like a psychic, because that's exactly where I was going with it. Because, I know that once you become emotionally invested in a creative work, there's always the hope of repurposing that idea at some point later down the line, because it did, people connect with things that you genuinely put your emotion and genuinely put your heart into. That's transparent as day.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're all doomed because of AI. But
yeah, and that's a whole other thing. I am maybe naively, but I think in a few spaces, well, in a lot of spaces, I think AI can really, put people out of work. I am naively hopeful that, when it comes to writing, like prose, um, voice acting,
right,
it's just that humanity just isn't there. And I think
right,
that part of writing is like really think like there are words on a page. It was written by somebody else. That person is like there's words on a page that your brain is taking in and making a story out based on what you have inside your own experience, right? And that could exist with AI written words still, like your brain would still do that. But then the intersection of knowing that these words came from another experience entirely, like a human experience, um, I think that that's where the power comes from. So, my hope is that no matter how good AI gets, that it's still, unless it becomes self-aware, was a whole nother thing. Uh, um, if it crosses the singularity, then it becomes a whole other issue. But I think that it's still like lacking that humanity is, I think that one day, I don't know, this would still not be ideal, but one day, like, people may be seeking out like the actual, like human created things, versus, just the same old, AI fluff. But I don't know. I could be naive about that.
I'm optimistic. I sincerely believe that trust in the human spirit and the fact that AI will not be able to replicate emotional intelligence. Ultimately,
Yeah.
that's where the connectivity happens for sure. I have hope for all actors and writers and any creative out there. I mean, there's been some pretty amazing musical things done with AI recently that I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But I digress. So let's talk about The World Wasn't Ready for You specifically. That's dropping on September 19th.
Yes.
What can you tell us all about that?
So, The World Wasn't Ready for You is a collection of 8 short stories, all of my short stories. And it's really an exploration of the speculative fiction genre. So, there's some horror stories in there. There's some science fiction stories in there. There's some, I'd say, like soft fantasy stories in terms of like they have, they're not horror, not science fiction, but have fantastical elements. Um, and really, my love of writing and reading, like going back to when I was a kid, like being inspired by Goosebumps to Stephen King, like that whole trajectory. So I have like the story in there that's about what's it called? A possessed, I was thinking of the word possession, a possessed puppet story, going back to, Night of the Living Dummy, always wanted to kind of write something along those lines. And then there's also stories that there's a body horror story in there that's mainly from like I had read like a body horror short story a few years ago, and I was like, this is really cool, just in terms of like where this went, and then going back and looking at some of the classic movies like that, like with The Fly, and that's usually kind of my impetus, like what can I do with this cool idea, and then as I'm filling in the other elements, and mainly like those elements being like parts of my identity. So I'm a Black male. I grew up in DC, mostly, Black schools, Black environments, and then went to medical school where for the first time I kind of felt not to anybody's purposeful fault, but felt, it felt the minority, felt like a token in some ways. So, dealing with that also as a writer and a reader, right? Realizing that when I was growing up, a lot of the the stories that I was reading, didn't really have me reflected in it. And
Right.
the way I show that or I tell people is that the novel I have here sitting on my bookshelf that I first sat down to write, the main character is blonde haired, blue eyed boy, and that was just what naturally came out of me. And I remember being in a writing group, and one of my writing group partners, very well meaning, was just like halfway through the story. It was like, "Oh, I didn't realize that the main character was black until then." And I remember thinking, I was like, "Well, what else would they be?" Just in terms of
Right.
that's. But and that's a lot of the things that I think, grappled with in evolution as a writer, because I think I felt that same thing in the beginning. It's like, well, I can't make I can't or wouldn't make the characters black unless I have something to say about it, unless it's like a black story, right? Because that's like something special. Versus as I kind of just came into my own identity and as a writer, you know, that just started to be, that's where I started off with. That's the experience I started with. But then also recognizing the responsibility of, you know, what am I representing? Like, am I representing this in a positive light? Not just positive, in a responsible light. And I think as I went on and became a doctor, and especially like a psychiatrist in mental health, like if there are people who struggle with mental health, am I being responsible about that? Am I
Right.
aware of things that I know and that I don't know? So in a lot of the stories, you can feel that there's, I think, something profoundly said there. And I know that because of how people have interacted with the stories. And that might not be my intention with sitting down to write it. So, for example, one of the stories, Spider King, is my body horror story. And it's about a family man who went to jail, taking the rap for a friend, and then takes a plea deal, but it's where he agrees to be part of like an experiment to get out of jail. And he thinks that is a medication for like anxiety, injection for anxiety. But what it makes is that his body starts producing like spiders. Spiders start to like pop out of his skin, and then he's slowly able to kind of control them. So someone read that a couple of years ago, and they wrote me and said like, this really made me feel heard with my anxiety, because it became a metaphor for the anxiety of returning to society, in terms of, how it manifested when he's trying to be at work and trying to like hide this thing that he feels like marks him as like a monster. And I think that that really speaks to, especially like people coming from being incarcerated and trying to get back into society, even though they don't have like a big label on their forehead. It's still, there's something about them that society still sees, still tries to kind of stay away from, and makes it a lot more difficult for them. So I think that comes through in that story. Um, and then there's a story in there where it's called Now You See Me. It's basically taking my medical background. The main character is an OBGYN resident. And then the three main characters there are three white women, and they go to see an exhibit, a Black art exhibit, where it's like the Black art exhibit. So I was going to say it's like the picture of Dorian Gray. I can't actually remember if I got the name of that right, but the name of that story. But it's like the picture of Dorian Gray, and they go to the exhibit, and the effect it has is that it makes each of them slowly embody what the Black experience in America is like. So the main character, for example, slowly becomes invisible, but also hypervisible. So she loses some of her identity and her autonomy and her job, because people aren't paying attention to her anymore, aren't respecting her anymore. But if she slips up and makes a mistake, everybody notices immediately. Like, she gets the harshest punishments and things like that. So it's an exaggeration of it. But it's called Now You See Me, and it's just, stemmed from a story. I remember someone gave me a prompt. I was doing this like writing workshop, and it was like art that changes you. So I sat down with that, and then
Oh,
one thing
great.
leads to another, and then it's like what can I say with this? But how can I be responsible about it? How can I say it so that, even, if the main character, like, oh, white woman reads this, they just don't come away saying like, oh, well, this was offensive, or isn't how I think, or, this doesn't apply to me. Really kind of, I think, using that nuance and really taking away like what's the bad guy, what's the good guy,
Right.
and just, having like a genuine experience and having fun with it is hard.
Oh my goodness. When I was listening to your story and your kind of reflections on all of this, I thought of two things. First thing being The Body
Mm-hmm.
by Stephen King, which became Stand By Me. And the reason why that resonated with so many kids when they were younger, because it was a reflection
Yeah.
of their experience. Then I think about more recent times, how Jordan Peele has been really deliberately putting out great works about representation and how it has a metaphorical effect. I absolutely love this, sir. Like, I'm like, I am so excited to read your book. I'm like, okay, yes, give me more. How does that feel to you to be able to get this out there and actually have like poignant significance behind everything? It's almost like you have a duality of purpose here, to where you're giving an entertaining piece of fiction and you're also giving the reader an opportunity to self-reflect to a certain degree.
Yeah. Yeah. I really want to recreate what reading did for me. I think, cliche wise, it's definitely, I think, a vessel to, to live more life than we may be able to just in our 70, however many years we have here.
Right.
I'm a doctor and a writer, and I know that, a lot of people aren't going to be able to experience that. I would love to be an astronaut. I would love to be a firefighter. I'd love to, go visit the Titanic. Probably will never try that, but if I knew I was going to survive, I would love to. But and I think that reading like genuinely gives the ability to kind of imagine yourself and experience some of these things that you just may never actually be able to experience in the life that you're living. And I think that was so powerful for me. And I think part of that is also then coming to a greater understanding about others. And I think that as I've taken that seed of just the love of creativity, and it's become part of like a responsibility, in the same way that there's like a love for medicine and narrative, and there's a responsibility when I work with one-on-one with a patient, to try to kind of help them find themselves, try to help them be heard, etc. All those things. And I think the same thing with writing is that, okay, I want to have fun with this, but I also I want the person who comes to this, especially with horror, if I'm going to try to make them feel something and that feeling is going to be difficult, I want it to be worth it. And sometimes it's hard to kind of articulate exactly, what that may be. I think I
Right.
align a lot with the thought that, horror can be healing. I don't really know how to explain it, but I resonate with it. In one of the stories that I have in here, like the possessed, puppet story, I realized I was writing it back in 2015, and I was writing it late at night, and I looked up and realized it was July 23rd, and that was the anniversary of my cousin being shot and killed back in 2004. And I realized that like the one of the characters in the story I had named after my cousin, and I realized it was a story about dealing with what I think was like his less than ideal like childhood and upbringing, and trying to work that out, so that I can write an ending that is a lot more healing than what actually happened in real life. And writing has
Right.
been, I think, a great vessel for that. It's a feeling of Responsibility sounds burdensome. It sounds heavy. But I think that it makes the work better. And I think that it also just means that, I'm just doing my due diligence, even as, for example, like a psychiatrist, if I have someone in my stories who have schizophrenia, I don't assume that just because I'm a mental health professional that like I'm just automatically going to have like a just know everything and have a perfect representation of that. I still like would do my due diligence to like look at like firsthand accounts of people who have that, try to see like what tropes already exist in fiction or in cinema, just to and then I love to kind of tackle those, or subvert them. So really just trying to have that responsibility, because also I know as a psychiatrist, though I don't feel like when I sit down, I'm sitting down as like I'm a psychiatrist who's trying fiction. I've been like a writer for a long time. But as a psychiatrist, I never would want, something that I've written that may not be the most responsible to then be used as like, well, look, this is how the psychiatrist has portrayed it. So I think that that's where like when I sit down and write, it's like, okay, let's have fun, but also make sure that since you're like touching on these issues and these issues just come on the page naturally for me, make sure like you're giving great thought to it. Make sure you're making people think, and not just, for lack of a better term, like increasing the harm that's out there.
And it sounds like your vessel of creativity is incredibly therapeutic for you as a person outside of the realm of being a psychiatrist or an author, which leads me to my next question. You push all those things aside. You push aside the fact that you're an author. You push aside the fact that you're a psychiatrist. What fuels Justin Key's fire in life day to day?
Yeah. It My answer is gonna sound like I need a therapist myself. Um but there are a few things. I think that I grew up only child, single mom in DC. My mom loved on me very hard. And I think part of me seeing like outcomes be different for different people. And I think a very early, from very early on, I did not think that those differences in outcomes were because of something that I innately chose, right? Like I didn't choose to have a mother who loved on me hard. I didn't choose that. Like a lot of things in school came easy to me. Math just came really easy to me. And I remember I would recognize that, like, it didn't come as easy to other people. So I think from very early on, going on and then going to Stanford, right? And I think with that, it's like, man, like I'm, the only one so far in my family who's gone this far. Like I need to make it count. My cousin is only lived at 25 and I was 17. Like I don't have any good reason for why him and not me. So if I'm going forward, I want to take full advantage of like what I've been put here to do. So even as I go forward and I have this collection out and it's starting to get reviews, unfortunately, as the positive reviews come out, part of my brain is like, okay, can I live up to this? Can I,
Right.
can I like do this again? Can whatever it feels like I have the ball in my court to do something special, can and not everybody's able to have that. Can I do something with it? And it's something that I have to
Right.
kind of keep in check, right? I have to tell myself that even if another book never comes out, like the fact that I'll be able to see this in hardcover and people read it, it's like a dream come true, right? I know that if
Yes.
this is the end of the road for me, it'd be a big disappointment. But I also have to recognize that, like, that even getting past that, it's still like it's a great accomplishment. So, and I think that also with that, with on the psychiatry side, um, it's also, there aren't too many black therapists or black psychiatrists, and I have patients who find me who's like, you're a unicorn, like you're like a black male psychiatrist, it's so hard to find. And um, I know that I put a lot of thought and time, especially in helping guide people who, one, have either never seen like a psychiatrist or a therapist, so they're naturally going to be anxious about it, or two, have had bad experiences in the past. Those are like my two favorite types to work with, even though it's like a big challenge. It can be anxiety provoking myself because
Right.
I get to, and a lot of times, not always, but I get to see them become more comfortable because they feel heard, see them become more comfortable because they realize that I'm not there to just like push a specific medication. And they might be like, I'm not sure about medication right now. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll see you again at this time. And, it's like, oh, I don't need to take medication to continue seeing you. I'm like, I think of myself as a tool, and to help you get to become your best self, and if I push something that you are totally not for or aren't ready to talk about yet, then you're not going to come back and see me, and then I'm not going to be able to help you, So recognizing that too, it's like, okay, if I am this and I'm in the world, why not continue to go forward and try to do this good work?
There's a phrase that I throw out there, and it is, you are an individual, but so is everybody else. And everybody is one of one, right? Their own unique person. And the thing is actualizing that within yourself can be burdensome sometimes because you're carrying that around. Creatively speaking, it is that, okay, can I top this last endeavor with my next one? And that can kind of create its own headspace. Yeah. That can be unhealthy sometimes because then you start to overthink and you become underproductive because you're overthinking it instead of just letting things organically flow. So how do you put yourself in that right headspace to where you can just let go of what you're trying to top and just let things go organically?
So hard to do. And I think that one of the answers is that if I only wrote when I was able to do that successfully, I wouldn't write enough as I would need to meet deadlines. So, and now this is kind of like having deadlines is like a new thing to me. Like before there was no deadline, nobody was waiting, but now I have like a deadline for things. But I think over the years, what I have been able to do is be comfortable with knowing that, okay, maybe I'm not at the top of my form in this writing session, but I'm still going to get things down. And maybe I feel like I'm not able to write this scene right now, but I can put a bracket right there that says, insert really cool scene here, and then go on to what it is that I feel like I may be able to write then. And maybe it's some of the more mundane aspects, or maybe it's like line edits, or maybe it's something that I don't have to feel like as geniusly creative. Not that I feel that often while writing. So I think being able to do that so that I can still make some progress, because a lot of times it's hard. And I'm writing right now. So with HarperCollins, I have a 2-book deal, which is amazing, but also amazingly stressful, where they bought the short story collection, and then they were also bought a novel that I'm finishing now. And that one's due October 2nd. So this book comes out October 19th, and then 2 weeks later, this novel that I've been working on rigorously for the last year, but really like over the last 10 years, is due. So I'm I'm in like the mode really for the last 6 months. I've been in the mode of like, there's never enough time, right? It's like, and it's
Right.
so interesting. I think working on something that big is that I could spend like a weekend and be like, I only got through two chapters. What, what is going on here? Or, you know, spend like hours and it's just like I've edited like a few pages or what have you. Um, and there are times I think with this and feeling like internally it feels like there's so much at stake with it when really there isn't, but internally it is. There are times where I do have those thoughts of, am I good enough for this? Is this going to be any good at all? Like, what am I doing? Am I going on the right path? Um, and I have to kind of fight through those because then, like the clouds clear up or the clouds part, and then I have, and I think I'm in that moment right now. Thankfully, I have like where the moments where I'm like, oh, this is really cool, and
Yeah.
this is going to be something one day, and people are going to read it. And I really love where this is going and it's coming together. And then I think that I have to remember those moments, when I'm kind of in the pits of it and like, oh my goodness, this is such a beast. How am I going to do this or make like any leeway on it? The 2 hours that I've put aside for today, so it's a balancing act.
And it's incredible to hear you talk about all of this because it feels like you're in a zone right now. It's that anticipation of this first book dropping while also completing the follow-up full length novel, because that can kind of create its own headspace as well. I mean, I can only go back to my own personal experience in the same regard with music. There was some sense of anticipation right before an album were to drop where it's like, I don't know what's going to
Yeah.
happen next, but I sure do enjoy the feeling of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what it's been like now, especially with like the short story collection. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, at least with me. I know that short story collections usually just don't do as well. So I'm trying to kind of, just prepare myself for that. But I'm also getting like, there's reviews that's coming through, and it's like, wow, they love me, they really love me, and then, I'm seeing it pop up on Instagram from people that I don't even know who's, have I think they get it from this newsletter that goes out and they specifically requested it. And then, it's like a person I've never seen before, like posting a picture of like my book on their thing or talking about it or excited to read it or posting reviews is very surreal. So I have to remember that even if it comes, September 19th or what have you comes and it's like, yeah, the sales aren't that great or et cetera, et cetera. Just have to remember that, similar, I think, to sports, just with, I think about, not to use too much of a analogy, but think about basketball, like just the disappointment when they lose somebody loses a championship. And it's like, you've gotten to a point that 99.9999% of the people in the world this year did not make it, too. And, it's that
Right.
duality of, yeah, wanting it to be more and wanting it to best, but also recognizing that like, yeah, this is an accomplishment. And there's always going to be, something that could be more. You can win a championship, or were you like the finals MVP? You were a finals MVP, but did you do it 6 times? You know what I mean? There's always going to be more. And I think having that, being able to be like, okay, if it doesn't sell well, yes, it'll be disappointing, but it's still like a great, cool ride. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and you've got stories appearing in two other compilations that are coming out. One compilation called Many Worlds, and the other one that I just saw on Instagram was Out There Screaming, that's dropping
Yeah.
October 3rd. And it's got a forward written by the aforementioned Jordan Peele. What can you tell us
Yeah. Yeah.
about
So
those?
many worlds, um, col- uh, collective world building, spearheaded by Codwell Turnbull. and who I've worked on a few like collaborative projects in the past, and was lucky to work on with this. And it's taking the idea of having like stories that are linked, you know, in almost like similar to like the different like the cinematic universes, like having stories that have this link,
Right.
and that are bound by like similar laws, and bringing like a lot of different writers together and trying to have that as a jumping off point for novels that want to take place in this universe, for short stories, etc. And the short story that I have in there, is it takes place on a far future world where humans or human-like creatures or species has evolved to where they mainly communicate with like telekinesis, and they really have like almost like a hive mind. And the people that are born there are um, who are not as so people can be born without that ability, but they effectively have our brains. So the
Oh, wow.
what it is me basically trying to tackle, neurodivergence or something like being on the autism spectrum, and fast forwarding it to where it's like what we consider as normal now is that in this future, like they're the ones with the that have to be put that they have to go through like the special schools, or they're the ones that their parents don't understand them or aren't able to communicate with them effectively. And so it's from that perspective. So it was a way for me to really, I think, tackle like society's intersection with neurodivergence, but do it in a way from like an experience that I have, like in terms of like writing from a perspective that is really like my perception of what my mind would be, but then also showing that how it manifests in society is that they're really considered to have like a disability because of society's shortcoming. Whereas, there could be a society that is built that where they could thrive. And so kind of positing in that same way that some of the people that we may say or think are quote unquote disabled, society just may not be set up for them to thrive. So that's the many worlds one. And then so the Jordan Peele anthology, Out There Screaming, so that's really exciting. I had to sign like an NDA for it. Like last year, John Joseph Adams, the editor on it, had reached out to me, and said he was doing like this very important anthology. And then I found out that it was by Jordan Peele, and I was like, I don't have time for this, but yes, of course, I do not have time at all, but yes, I will. And it's funny. I found out a few days before I was on this panel at an art museum, and it was about science fiction and I think art or creativity. I forget the exact name of the panel, but during it, somebody in the audience asked a question. They were like, have you all ever seen like a new type of art in science fiction? I feel like that hasn't been done. And whether that's been done or not, is debatable. But I was answering, and in the moment, I said, well, think about, genetics and human genetics and being able to edit the genome. And what if, like in the future, like it was so accessible that people were able to edit it to a degree where they could create humans that are considered art, and then like different different individuals or companies or what have you are, able to create these art pieces, but then what would it be like to actually like live your life as that art? So
Oh,
I
wow.
remember joking then and saying like, I got to leave to go write the story, but I went home and actually started writing the story. And that's the story that's in the Jordan Peele anthology. So it's a horror story, but it's in that setting. And the main character, those stories called The Aesthete. and the main character is one of these like art pieces. And you see like the backdrop and the implications and in society and all the things that have gone wrong. And it's like a horror love story where he thinks that his love interest has been taken by the collector, like somebody who collects art, human art. And then he kind of goes through this deep, dark rabbit hole to try to get her back. And that's as much as I could probably say about it. But it's yeah, yeah.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. That leads me to a few wrap-up questions. And first one being is, where do you see yourself 1 year from now versus 5 years from now as far as being a writer goes?
So 1 year from now, it's fairly straightforward. I'm hoping that I'm in the same place I am right now with the collection, but with the novel. 1 year from now, like my editor has been like, we can work with this, has given me edits back. And I've edited it, turned it back in, and they're like, this is finished. This is great. Let's go forward. And it's slated to come out around this time, fall of next year. Seems like a lot of uncertainty between now and then, but I think that everybody wants that to be like, that's what everybody wants, like a year from now. So, no pressure, but if I can make that happen, that's where that's going to be. I do have TV and film representation. It's funny. That's actually how I started on this leveling up journey, is that, someone here, just met serendipitously, read my short stories, and they were like, I want to represent you for TV and film. Let's find you like a literary agent, and then the rest is kind of history. So, there's been a lot of exciting conversations with that. Everything's pretty much put on hold right now with like the 2 strikes going on, both of which I support, by the way. So we'll just see where things go with that in the future. That's a very exciting and new thing. Somebody told me once that publishing is no, 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 yes, and then Hollywood is yes, 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 no. So I'm
great analogy.
Cautiously optimistic about that piece, but who knows what that might come about in next year. And I say 5 years from now, like, I'll just say it. I want to write a book a year. And I was kind of pausing now, because now that I'm like, 2 months out from this novel being due, like a book a year, maybe a book a lifetime. but I remember just seeing like Stephen King putting out like a book a year. So I'd love to be in a place where, writing like a book a year, like doing novels. And then I'd still be doing psychiatry work. I don't think that I would be doing psychiatry like full time, but I would still be keeping on a good panel of patients. But the dream book wise would be doing about a novel a year. So that's where I'll be. So I guess 5 years from now, realistically, this second book, let's see if it comes out next year. We got to get some time to see how that does. Maybe the next one will come out 2 years from then, and then another year. So maybe 5 years, be looking at my 4th book, maybe.
Yeah, there we go. And possibly some TV and movie options attached to these short stories and books. I honestly was going to go there, but then I thought to myself, there are a couple of strikes going on, so I don't want to go too deep into that. But I also wanted to highlight more of your current happenings as opposed to venture off into what could be. But I am super excited to hear that, because honest to goodness, while I was listening to some of your descriptors, I'm like, that would be such a great movie or a miniseries or something along those lines. With that said, what is your favorite Stephen King book, being such a huge Stephen King fan yourself?
Man, I might give a few different answers to this. The one that scared me the most was The Shining. It's hard. It could be just so, there's a part in it where like he like kills all these wasps in like a bottle, and then he puts it outside, and the next morning they're all dead. The next morning they're all alive. And it's just like, if that ever happened, just like subtle things, if they ever happen in like real life, it'd be like the whole world's turned upside down. You know what I mean? So I remember that
his power was always in nuance.
Yeah. And I'd say epically, it's long. It has some of its issues. I don't know if you've ever read it. It has like a part that probably, well, that could have been left out, but it's something I've always, I think, wanted to do. Some not that part that should be left out, but do something like in terms of like almost having like a whole town almost be like the like a character. And I think there's something like
Yes.
strong about like that childhood, nostalgia. Like I didn't grow up in the 50s or 60s, but something about being a kid and reading it, and that childhood horror. So I really like loved and appreciate like the epicness of it. And yeah, so I would say, if I had to, beach, if I was on a desert island and only had one of his books, I feel like it'd probably be it, because by the time I finish it, I'd be like, oh, what was the beginning like? I can go back and read it again. Yeah.
Right, right. So fun little footnote here is when I was a kid, I used to go to thrift stores, garage sales. I collected Stephen King books. So if I could find something on hardcover, it went home with me and it sat on the shelf. My favorite has always been Different Seasons for some reason. The 4 short stories.
Yeah.
There's a short story called Rage.
Mhm.
And if you get a chance to read that one, it eerily paralleled the events of Columbine like
Oh, wow, okay.
20 years before Columbine even happened. So I remember the day that Columbine happened, and I was actually sitting in a restaurant with a friend, and we're watching this unfold on TV, and my mind immediately went to that Stephen King book, and I was like, Stephen King predicted this.
Yeah, like The
It's a
Simpsons.
little crazy. Yes, exactly. Like The Simpsons. It was such an eerie feeling. And I've never been able to share that experience with a lot of people because let's be honest, a lot of people don't read Stephen King, they watch Stephen King. Unfortunately.
It's a shame. And I think I have Different Seasons. I'm looking. Oh, that's Needful Things. But I will definitely. I don't think I've read Rage, but I would definitely look for it. I have a whole Stephen King row. But one of the things Stephen King, he's not just a horror writer. Like Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile. He tells this story. I wonder if I can tell it over, but I guess it's fine. But he tells this story. He's told it like a few times where he was like in a grocery store, and this older lady came up to him and was like, "Are you that horror writer that writes all those scary things?" And he was like, "Yes." And she was like, "I don't like things like that. I like stuff like the Green Mile and Shawshank Redemption." And he was like, "I wrote those." She was like, "No, you didn't." So
Right?
yes, so he's just really
Stand
great.
by me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Man, this has been an amazing conversation. The last question I ask every guest, and it's your turn to be in the barrel for it, is what is your advice for making the world a better place tomorrow than what it is today?
My advice, the first thing that comes to mind is recognizing that each of us has a unique perspective and experience, and our brains create a model of the world to help shepherd us through that perspective and experience, and using that to continue to question your assumptions about the world and about other people. This is a long way of saying, trying to be more empathetic, trying to have more, I think, doubt with, not doubt, I think curiosity with other people's experience, their assumptions, and where they're coming from. And I think that can lead to better conversations and discourse without having to, minimize or jeopardize the things that you believe in. That makes sense.
Yes. Yes, it does, sir. Yes, it does. Justin C. Key, I am so glad that we are friends now.
Yeah.
This is more than just a podcasting guesting platform, buddy. We are friends now. I would love to have you on the show again in the future.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I really appreciate being here. And, thank you for your time. Thanks for inviting me here.
Oh, man. Thank you very much. The world's a much better place with you in it, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. The world wasn't ready. but now they are.
That's right. Once again, I want to thank my friend Justin C. Key for doing the show today. The World Wasn't Ready for You comes out on HarperCollins on September 19th, 2023. Make sure you pick up a copy and support Justin. I have a feeling we are going to be hearing a lot more from him in the future. And an editorial footnote citing my own mistake: the short story Rage, written by Stephen King under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, was contained in the Bachman books, not in different seasons. My bad. Make sure you give Justin Key a follow on all social media platforms. Visit him at justinkey.com. And while you're checking things out, make sure you give Caught on the Mic on all of your favorite social media platforms, and visit me, www.caughtonthemic.com. You can also shoot me an email at caughtonthemic@gmail.com. This has been Caught on the Mic with Michael Clark. I'm Michael Clark. Until next time, thank you.